Okay, hello everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, and good night for people in Beijing like me. It's almost 10 p.m. here. Welcome to the Think Fest Conversations. And Think Fest Conversations, Think Fest is a platform that was established in 2016, and it is aimed at bringing academics, scholars, and thinkers from different fields to come and have conversations that matter on economic issue, on regional issues. And today's topic is US-China relations, a very important topic, and how this relationship is evolving in the region of East Asia. I'm Zoon Ahmed Khan, Research Fellow at Tsinghua University and also pursuing my PhD at Tsinghua. I've been in Beijing for 6 years and my focus is Chinese foreign policy. So, of course, this is a very important topic for me. And today it's an absolute honor for us to host Dr. Matteo Dian. Dr. Matteo is a senior assistant professor at the Department of Political and Social Science at the University of Bologna. Previously, he held research and teaching positions at the University of Oxford and London School of Economics, among others. He has written many books on the topic of US-China relations and other regional issues as well. Just to name one, The Evolution of US-Japan Alliance, The Eagle and the Chrysanthemum. And also another one, Contested Memoirs in Chinese and Japanese Foreign Policy. His research focus is international relations theory, security in East Asia, Japanese and Chinese foreign policy, and US foreign policy in the Asia Pacific region. Dr. Matteo, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Zoon. Thank you very much for a very kind introduction. And thank you to the organizers of Think Fest Conversations. It's a pleasure to be with you, even if online. Hopefully in the future, these kind of events would return to be live, and hopefully I will join you sometimes. Do you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you clearly.
Of course, I was saying hopefully in the future, this kind of things would return to be organized in person, and maybe I will join you there. Or in China, or in Pakistan.
In China, in Pakistan, in Italy. So for my first question, because this is such an extensive topic, there's so much we can talk about. Let's start with the models of regional and global order that both China and the US are promoting. I think I would briefly talk about how in recent years, especially since less than a decade ago, we saw many developments. The first, perhaps, and you may elaborate on this as well, the first realization of proper movement that the United States pursued to focus its energies towards East Asia was its pivot to East Asia in 2012. And for some people, that was the turning point. And then in 2013, we saw China's Belt and Road Initiative being announced. So these 8-9 years have been absolutely decisive and have changed how both of the countries, the US and China, are perceiving their role in the world, and especially in the East Asian region. So can you talk a bit about the models and the policies that both countries are pursuing?
Yes, sure. What came out in the last 2-3 decades is that, of course, on one hand, we have an American model of the region for East Asia that varied in terms of geographical definition, but has been constant in terms of the role that the United States want for themselves as a great power, in terms of security dynamics, but also in terms of rules and norms and institutional structures. The United States, of course, want to preserve a regional order that sees a primacy for them, that sees alliances strengthened in the realm of security. This is the case, of course, of Japan, in the case of the US-ROK alliance, the relationship with Australia, and to a lesser extent, the alliances with Thailand and the Philippines. This is something a lot of scholars, especially in the realist perspective and approach, is focused on. And if we see the order in East Asia from that point of view, we see sort of reinforcement of the American position. But it's also true that the United States are promoting an order which is not entirely based on security, is also based on values. So there is an idea of integrating the region in a broader order that normally we call liberal international order, that will be based on ideas such as multilateralism in a certain extent, international law, freedom of navigation, human rights, and so on. From this point of view, there was a strong integration between the global order and the regional order in Asia, which is based on different dimensions: a security dimension, an economic dimension, and a normative dimension. So those three are important to understand where the regional order goes. And those three are also important to understand the difference between the order promoted by the United States and the order promoted by China. In my recent work, I used the theory of the English School of International Relations. In those terms, in those theoretical terms, the idea of order is something based on the distribution of power, but it's also based on ideas and norms that are shared.
And norms and ideas, if I may intervene,
yeah,
also depends on political structures.
Of course, the political structures and understanding. Yeah. Yes, of course, in terms of what the English school calls primary institutions. So a certain idea of what is the role of great powers. How many great powers should we have in a region? And here there is a big difference between what China thinks and what the United States thinks. On the idea of sovereignty and how central sovereignty should be, sovereignty of self-determination, the idea of human rights, the idea of market, for instance, the idea of multilateralism. So China and the United States have deeply different takes on those primary institutions. In terms of great powers and their role, China would like to see a region in which Beijing is central in shaping rules and norms and institutions. On the other hand, Washington would like to be the main promoter of order in East Asia, thinking maybe to see China as a partner sometimes, but still preserving a position of primacy, while China thinks that US and China should be equal on a global level, but China should be a protagonist in the region. Sovereignty is another interesting difference. For China, sovereignty is the core of the international order. Self-determination, autonomy are the normative core of the order that China is trying to promote. Everyone has his own way to develop. That is the Chinese message in essence. Of course, the American message, and more broadly the liberal message in the West, is the main way to find economic development is liberal democracy. And therefore, someone that is liberal would link political democracy with capitalism, with development. While the big difference of the Chinese message, in essence, is you can find your own way that can be different from the Western way, and you can achieve development, strength, and power in another way. It's not necessarily the Chinese way, it can be your own way. Okay, this is one take on the difference between the two models. And of course, there are different interpretations in terms of multilateralism. What is the good way to choose? In this sense, it's not that one wants multilateralism, the other doesn't. Is more different perspective on what is the good way to promote it. As much as there's different perspective on the priority to attribute to human rights, and as much as there is a different perspective of what is the role of the state in economic development. The United States are promoting a form of development which is based on the retreat of the state. On the other hand, China is promoting a model in which state-owned enterprises and the direct intervention of political power is much more present and is considered to be necessary to put forward development. And all these issues are important when we look at the evolution of the international order. It's not simply capabilities, not simply power. And this is the big difference between the English school in general, my perspective, for instance, that can be sort of counted in that field, versus realism, versus those like John Mearsheimer, that was a guest of ThinkFest as well, argued. And for him, just because China is rising, China will become a revisionist power, and that is inevitable and that is normal. My take is much more, we have to take into account all those perspectives. So the political, the military, the economic and the normative, understanding the differences, but also understanding that an international order can work if great powers can produce legitimate solutions for problems of governance, development, and peace.
In that sense, so you also brushed upon how for the United States, economic development is a result of liberal democracies. I mean, it is possible, and the desirable world view that they have is that countries should naturally aspire towards this governance model. But then we see successes in East Asia as well. They were not liberal democracies per se in many cases. And those became the exceptional models for development, economic development, and socioeconomic progress for many developing countries. China itself, in 2001, when China entered the WTO, at that time, Bill Clinton said, we hope and we expect that with this economic openness will come political change and reform as well. But that did not happen. So do you think that in some sense, even when we look at East Asia, even when you look at certain allies of the US, we see that this model, this natural trajectory is not being followed? Do you think there is a perspective that can engage, like, yes, the United States pursued liberal world order can include countries that do not necessarily follow the same political systems, that the success of those countries is legitimate and durable?
Of course. Here, I mean, there's an interesting question, and there are three different points about this. The first is that I genuinely believe that the vast majority of Americans, surely policymakers, are convinced of their model and are convinced that economic success comes out of economic freedom, which is inseparable from political freedom. And this is sort of the perspective of the United States, the perspective of much of the West. However, when this was applied to Asia, it didn't work in the same way. You mentioned China and the WTO. Of course, for China, entering within the WTO was the key moment to accelerate further economic growth, to become a real economic partner, and then the main economic partner for most states in the world, not just in East Asia, in Europe as well, and in Latin America, in Africa, everywhere. That was a key critical juncture for the international order of today. Someone that thinks in terms of, in liberal terms, would expect that trade would lead to domestic political change. Of course, China has a vast middle class nowadays that is consuming, that is investing, that is growing. And that doesn't necessarily mean that China will change in the same way that other countries experience, and doesn't mean that China will follow a Western model, and we know that. So there is surely, and we are seeing it now with our eyes, that there is an alternative. However, what happened is that the United States, in a moment, it was another key moment in the development of the East Asian order, continued sort of to preach the same verb, especially after the Asian financial crisis, 1997-98. And that was an interesting moment, because not just the United States, the IMF in general, sort of the global institutions, sought to advance a certain understanding of structural reforms, for instance, of changing economic systems, sort of imposing certain changes. And that was the first moment in which in Asia emerged a demand for something else. China was not at that moment in time that rich and that developed to offer the alternative. And therefore you had ASEAN plus 3, it was Japan itself with South Korea and China and the ASEAN countries to try to promote something different in terms of economic governance. But that was the first moment in time in which the American influence in terms of ideas and economic influence started to decline. And then came the global financial crisis. and then came Trump. So the trajectory of relative, and again, it's not total decline, but it's relative decline of the American influence in Asia is well before the last 4, 5, 10 years. Is well before Xi Jinping, is well before Trump, because many times we tend to focus way too much on what is happening now, has happened in the last 4 years. But those things have roots that are deeper. And therefore, understanding those roots and also understanding that the fact that at a certain point, maybe there was not a lot of flexibility in trying to understand that other systems would work in a different way. There was not enough flexibility in understanding that other economic systems would prefer to deal with the crisis in another way. And that was an important moment in time. And of course, the global financial crisis was another important moment in time in which people and the elite, particularly in Asia, started to see that there are different possibilities, and the American leadership or American hegemony was not what it used to be. That doesn't mean rejecting the entire model, but it means that the order is much more contested, that another model is coming out. And that model is different in normative terms and political terms. So this, I think, is something important to understand when we analyze contemporary developments. And then we come to analyze what China is promoting today, or has been promoting since 2013. In a certain sense, there was a demand for those things even before. And then starts sort of the chain reaction of the United States seeking to advance other projects. But I think going back to the reasons that created that demand is important.
Right. Let's now come towards, because you brushed upon how over time, I wouldn't say the credibility, but the perception that there needs to be a uniform system that is necessarily going to be successful. And we saw different regions react differently. So let's talk now a bit about policies towards China. How different administrations over the years, since the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and now the Biden administration, what is the difference? And I think I think our viewers would also be interested in knowing what is the reason for changes in the policies that these administrations pursued. Were they reacting to China's increasing, I would say, influence, or maybe increasing growth? Or was it something domestic that drove their policy perspectives?
Well, I think that there is a bit of both, really. Of course, because when we talk about 2008, when President Obama was elected, China was completely different from China from 2021. So there is an element of China being richer, more powerful, more influential. There is an element of domestic politics that has evolved a lot in the United States. There is an element of who is the leader and the kind of influence the leader has on policies, and the advisors of the leader as well. If we go back to 2008, but especially 2011, the beginning of the pivot to Asia, the important thing to underline is that President Obama managed to put forward a grand strategy that had all the three elements in mind. There was a security component, largely based on the idea of strengthening alliances, Japan and South Korea, Australia particularly. So consolidate in that sense the American position in the Asia Pacific. There was an element of diplomacy. So reaching out, for instance, to Vietnam, reaching out to Thailand, reaching out to Myanmar, that at that moment in time was experiencing an opening, and then the transition to democracy for that period in time up to this year in Myanmar. So those two elements, and then the economic element. The Trans-Pacific Partnership was important. It was not simply a pact. The Trans-Pacific Partnership was a way to try to promote a vision of the international order based on a Pacific integration, a strong role of the United States in the region, but especially certain rules. If you go to read the text of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the most important parts are the parts on state-owned enterprises. And when you approve something that says, but basically in this area of integration, we don't want a privileged treatment for state-owned enterprises, you read, we don't want Chinese state-owned enterprises. So when you hear talking, or you could hear talking back then, of a possible integration of China within the TPP, it doesn't make any sense to me, because if something is based on a model which is antithetical on how the Chinese economy works, you cannot integrate China in, let alone the China is that big that will change completely the picture. But that was clearly a way to try to shape the norms of economic integration away from the Chinese model. So in those terms, the Obama administration had tried to promote the strategy, the three main legs. But despite that, there was still an idea of promoting a strategy that was mixed. In a certain way, the Obama administration still had the idea that there were many fronts and many issues that could see a US-Chinese cooperation. So it was not that dark as we can see now.
Confrontation.
Confrontational, great power rivalry kind of situation. And then, of course, Trump promoted a particularly significant change and drastic change. On the one hand, going in a direction of saying, okay, this will be confrontation, great power rivalry, no cooperation. So it was not nuanced, it was black and white. This is great power rivalry, this is mobilization for confrontation in the future, this will be ideological as well. So that was particularly stark and particularly sudden as well.
But was it also very unilateral as opposed to what the Obama administration was pursuing? Is that a view you would align with? That Trump's take on China or advance was very unilateral, and it also didn't take alliances together in the same way as now?
Well, I would agree completely on the alliances. I would say that part of the reaction was a Trumpian reaction. So it's a matter of who was the president, who were the advisors of the president. But the curious thing is what happened in the United States was a change that involved not just the Trump administration, but like 90% of the China scholars and experts, including those that came back in the Biden administration now. So I think that some of it was domestic politics, some of it was maybe unilateral, maybe seeing China gaining momentum and then the need to answer on the American side. Some of it was sort of intensification of things that were happening in Asia. South China Sea is an example, in which those are problems for the United States, are problems for the American position, are problems for the fact that the Americans, of course, want to maintain the reliability of the alliances, and that the credibility and reliability, the extended deterrence of the alliances, is put in difficulty by what China is doing in the South China Sea, so gray zone operations and all that. So the change of the status quo in certain areas of East Asia, of course, had an impact. But as you said, alliances are important as a matter of discussion, because on the one hand, the Trump administration went to say, well, this is great power rivalry, we want to go in a direction of confrontation. But at the same time, they undermined the very instruments that the United States have to promote, to consolidate the order in East Asia and to promote their position in the region. Mostly alliances. Japan, South Korea, Trump coming to office saying, well, you have to give me money if you want me to protect you, which is exactly how alliances should not work. Because if you want to have a reliable alliance, what you say... Shame. Yeah, exactly. If you want to have a reliable alliance, the one thing that you say, I will protect you no matter what happens, because you want to have credibility, you want your ally to feel safe. The same with South Korea.
Strong front, at least pretend
Exactly. I mean, the Article 5 issue with NATO and with Japan and with South Korea, simply going and say, I'm there for you, so you will not feel abandoned. Okay. In theory of alliances, people in IR theory would say, fear of alignment and fear of entrapment are the worst things you can generate for an ally. And normally, what you want to do is avoid fear of abandonment. Is the reason. Yeah, exactly. Is the reason why alliances would go on and do exercises, the reason why the US have troops in the region and so on and so forth. So the idea of going to the region and say, my commitment is conditional was a particularly bad idea. And on top of that, starting a trade war with China, but also putting tariffs on South Korea, on Japan, in a moment in which South Korea was experiencing a particularly dangerous moment with North Korea, by the way.
Yeah.
And that was a terrible idea. And instability for alliances is instability for the region. So that was, to say, not a good idea. Of course, especially in that happened in the first and second year, with the third year of the Trump administration, things started to stabilize in terms of alliances. But still, that idea lingered in Tokyo and Seoul, in Manila and other places. And feeling that the alliance might be not reliable is particularly difficult for partners in the region, despite the fact that Trump wanted to be tough with China and wanted to use tariffs and the trade war to try to coerce China. But I don't think it was a particularly wise strategy, not just towards the allies, but especially for the broader region, in which there is a lot of fear, both that the US-China rivalry would create instability, and in general, the fact that the United States might be not reliable. But I think if you see what diplomats and policymakers are writing in Southeast Asia, let's mention Singapore, for instance. There is an article by the Prime Minister of Singapore, I think it was 2019 in the summer, that clearly stated that the rivalry between the United States and China could endanger the Asian century. While the region is rising, economically growing, there is a shared prosperity increasingly. That is predicated upon stability in the region.
Yeah.
And the very presence of increasing rivalry put that in danger. And that is a particularly important take for basically everyone in the region. The region that wants to be open for trade, open for cooperation and multilateralism.
Predictability.
Predictability, exactly, and stability. If you don't have that, then all the energy that has been put into economic development is put at risk. So that is a particularly important take for, I think, everyone in the region.
Do you feel, so then let's come towards the Biden administration. How has the policy changed? And does it allow allies in East Asia or the region at large feel more secure? Or are we still heading in a direction where there is uncertainty for the region?
No, I think that, yeah, definitely there is an emphasis on alliances. If your wishes are going back to normal, really. The summit with Suga, the summit with Moon, were a clear example of the fact that the United States want to move forward and sort of forget about the period in which Trump was asking money, host nation support in billions of dollars to South Korea, to Japan. I mean, those things that could be minor problems became big problems during the Trump administration. The Biden administration is trying to sort of brush away those things and focus on the idea that alliances are back, those relationships are back to normal. But there's also an emphasis on what are sort of the future steps. Future steps with Tokyo, future steps with Seoul. The idea of building resilient global value chains, the idea of cooperating in cyber, cooperating in new technologies. 5G, of course, there is a competition that comes from China in those terms. But what are the new constituencies and the new frontiers for the alliance? There is this idea of, okay, we've gone back to the minimum and we have it. How can we move forward? And of course, this is sort of a big part of the consolidation of the American vision of the region. And there is another part that there is more sort of ground to cover, which is the economic lag, for sure. Because Trump withdrawing from the TPP, the trade war, has left traces in the region in a moment in which China was ready to provide an alternative to many states under the shape of the Belt and Road Initiative, for instance, and then offering, if RCEP was the other one, of course, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, in which, by the way, Japan is present, and South Korea and Australia and many allies of the United States. So there is this tension for most states in the region in which you can be an American ally and rely for your security on the United States. But your economic well-being often is associated with trade and cooperation with China. And this creates a tension. And this tension, on the one hand, is absolutely not captured by structural realism and certain theories in international politics that we often hear. But on the other, creates a difficult position for policymakers, because you want to preserve a good relationship with both. And you want to maintain a certain degree of independence and autonomy. So it's really complicated. If we look just at the part of the picture that goes towards security relationships, then we have a sort of a picture. If we want to look at the dimension defined by economic flaws, we have a completely another picture, which is much more centered on China. If we look at the dimension of ideas and values, we have even a more complicated picture, because you have states that, let's take it at Australia, right? Australia is a liberal democracy, has Western values, allied with the United States. 50% of exports go to China. And that is just an example. For everyone, really, is an example for the United States and the complication of putting forward solutions that are legitimate for the region, that are working for the region, that provide solutions in security, but also economic terms, but also for everyone else, for China as well, because China has been having a lot of issues, a lot of problems, and maybe overreacting sometimes vis-a-vis Australia. Because, of course, that creates problems then with European partners. European partners would see what happens to Australia.
I lost you for a moment.
Okay, sorry. I was saying that kind of tension between different...
I'm not sure if other people can hear, but for me, the voice is not clear. Let me confirm with Yaku. Can you hear me, Dr. Matteo?
Yeah, I can hear you perfectly.
Oh.
Okay.
I can't hear Dr. Matteo. Maybe I should come back to the broadcast.
Jakob says I can hear both.
Enter.
Yeah.
If you can hear me, can you raise your hand if you can hear me? Oh, I can't hear you. I should go and come back. I'll be back in a second. Hello?
Okay.
Yes,
Can you
I'm
hear?
okay. I apologize. I think that was a minute of a disruption. So
No
please
problem.
continue. I'm sorry.
Yes, as I was saying, I mean, there is this tension that emerges in the region, right? So, in one sense, we have a picture based on security relations, and the other economic relations that are much more centered on China, and therefore is something that is difficult to grasp for
Right.
policymakers. Is hard to make policies when you have this fundamental tension, and it's particularly curious to see cases like Australia, to see cases like states in Southeast Asia that, in a sense, are related to the US in security terms. They strongly cooperate with China. And then there is a normative dimension in ASEAN, of course, that sometimes for Westerners, especially here in Europe, is a bit harder to see, which is entirely based on the idea that ASEAN is there to preserve the sovereignty and the autonomy and the self-determination of the member states. Therefore, it is not anytime soon evolving in a direction similar to the European Union. Is that because that is not the overall aim of the association? ASEAN is much more based on preserving autonomy and sovereignty, and sort of keep the great powers out and keep stability within. So that is interesting to observe as well.
So here, I mean, I have a question, because obviously it's clear that this expectation for countries or regions to choose sides puts them in a difficult situation.
Yeah.
And here is a perspective from Beijing that the difference between China and the US is that China does not want to impose such restrictions on its partner countries. And that's a view that any country should just pursue its own pragmatic interests, and countries don't need to ally with the bigger power. What is the United States' view? What is the end result of a policy that wants to somehow, some way or the other, reduce the level to which China has influence? Is the end result to completely reduce China's influence? What is the purpose of this expectation or strategy, if you could explain?
So I would agree on the first part. So, of course, China doesn't want to impose any political system.
This is just a view, exactly.
No, of course, I agree on the fact that China doesn't. Of course, China promotes the idea of respecting the sovereignty of other states. So will not impose any particular form of government or domestic idea or value. I will not agree on the fact that China is open to the fact that other states would take autonomously their own view, their own interest. Of course, China likes when other states, as is normal, by the way, that every great power would do, prefer those states and those governments that tend to align with the priorities of China. And I guess that is entirely normal. So I think that is the difference. While the United States, as a liberal country, as a democratic country, would tend to say that they agree much more with those countries that share values and norms in domestic politics. So they are democracy, and they do align with them. Of course, China doesn't do that. But when it comes to interest, both countries would like to see their partners in the region more aligned with their priorities. And that is more an interest and power matter. In that sense, the two great powers are not entirely different. In terms of what are the objectives of the United States in the region, I would say preserving a position of leadership in the region. If you see, for instance, the entire idea of Indo-Pacific, which is how the United States are currently defining the region. This is something relatively new that for the United States came out during the Trump administration, but it's actually a Japanese concept that comes from the idea of the confluence of the two seas back in the Abe administration #1, 2007. And then was re-elaborated later on, and then was passed in a certain way to the United States. That is not a neutral concept. That is a very charged concept. It's not merely a geographical concept. So the idea of seeing the region from India to or from the Indian Ocean to the United States, it also means defining the region in a way in which the United States are, in security, economic, normative terms, leaders. And together with them, the maritime democracies, Australia, Japan, India, would contribute to shape the boundaries of the region and the norms of the region. So that would be probably the objective: continue to consolidate an order in which sort of China participates but is not the leader. And sort of making it broader geographically means also stressing the role of the others, India, Australia, Japan, in order to consolidate such an order. Of course, that order is predicated upon the credibility of the alliances, and that is the other important side, and the economic side as well. So I would say that is the overall objective. I don't think that that is necessarily in contrast with a certain expansion of the Chinese influence, which is natural. And I mean, China is so big that of course, will have an influence in the region. But from Washington's point of view, probably the idea is trying to make the order stable enough that can sort of withstand the gravity and the weight of China. I don't know in which extent that is possible, and I don't know in which extent that is possible without generating further competition and security, competition and stability. And that is hard to figure out. And I think the other important, to go back to the difference between Biden and Trump, the other important point, especially at the end of the Trump administration, and if you go back to read that document, it was called the China Challenge, that was published by State Department at the end of the Trump administration. I think that had a big issue and a big problem, that was not distinguishing between what was crucial and important, in other terms, core interests of the United States, and simply China moving forward and having more influence. And I think that was a strategic mistake also on the side of the United States, not distinguishing. For instance, during the Cold War, that was a big problem, not distinguishing. Not prioritizing, exactly. What is a core interest that has to be defended, absolutely, and what is just the other player getting more influence in the region. And then it creates many issues in terms of deciding where to act and what kind of allies to seek, and where to allocate resources, for instance.
Would you consider Quad to be an alliance, or is it still a partnership? Is it an alliance?
No, we're not. So
views on that.
I mean, speaking as someone that uses a lot of IR theory says that an alliance is something that has a mutual security clause. So you are committed to defend the other ally. So NATO is an alliance in that sense because there is a mutual security clause. If someone is attacked, all the others are going to defend them. The US-Japan alliance is an alliance in that sense. The United States are committed to defend Japan. And the same for South Korea or Australia. In those terms, the Quad is not an alliance. Australia did not commit to the defense of Japan. Japan did not commit to defense of Australia or India. So that doesn't make it an alliance in sort of strict terms. In IR sense, but I think in a broader sense, I mean, an alliance, that is an alliance. The rest is a partnership. So there is a cooperation between the four of them, of course. It's more political than anything else. I mean, militarily, there is the Malabar exercise, which is a signal, but it's not changing the world as we see it.
A lot is changing. We have actually 5 minutes before we start the Q&A. And I think what we can focus on is quickly what are the perspectives of these regions or countries on China's rise. So first, Japan.
Of course,
How
Japan.
they per-
The position is Japan, if you want, is rather unique. I mean, Japan is the only country that is basically entirely on board with the American vision. Japan wants to maintain a great power role in the region. Has consolidated the alliance with the United States, is entirely on board on creating Pacific-wide forms of integration rather than cooperating more with China in the economic realm. And that, in that sense, Japan stands apart from everyone else in the region. Even South Korea, for instance, allied with the United States, but very keen to cooperate with China because of North Korea, because of economic relations. Therefore, is really Japan is the core element and the core partner for the United States in the region. While for South Korea, but the others in ASEAN particularly, none of them is completely choosing side, not even completely choosing side with China. Everyone is trying to maintain a position in which they can preserve a certain amount of autonomy, self-determination. And they understand their own interests is not necessarily the same of either of them. And therefore, for them, it's good if China promotes initiatives in the realm of infrastructures. It's good if Japan does it. If different great powers or middle powers can sort of bid to provide, yes.
Yes, they shouldn't have to choose, but they can see their pragmatic interests
Exactly.
between both.
Exactly.
What about, since you mentioned NATO, what about the EU? Because I think the 16+1 arrangement, the CEC, got some attention from from the European Union as well.
Yes.
How does the EU perceive China's rise? And another thing was how the comprehensive agreement on investment almost got finalized after years of negotiation and then was cancelled. So we see a bit of back and forth.
Yes. So there are different elements here, and the EU is a very complex beast, if you wish, because of course there are certain things like trade that are competences of the European Union, while other things are more related to the competences of the states. And that is one part of it. There is the part of 16+1, which from a European point of view, and someone as myself that believes a lot in the European Union is not seen very well, because it's considered to be an attempt to sort of break the unity of the European Union. So from in that sense, is a strategic move on the Chinese side, and it's easy to understand why. And the European Union has its own faults in this, especially when there are states like Greece or other states in Eastern Europe that think they didn't deserve harsh treatments in the past from the EU, and therefore they tend to rely more on other partners like China. So in Europe, there are many different positions on China. All of them are distinct from the American position. On the one hand, there is a genuine belief that the global order should be based on liberal values. That is sort of the bottom line in Europe. On the other hand, China is seen as an opportunity in terms of economic development, in terms of export. Therefore, again, there is this tension, which is clearly present. And you can see it in Germany, you can see it in France, and you can see it how this impacts the transatlantic relation as well. But it's hard to say that the European Union is moving in a coordinated fashion. There are many different points of view inside. And in Italy particularly, yes. I mean, and again, this is something that maybe is not visible outside of Europe. But for instance, in Italy, we had a government in 2018, the government that later on signed a memorandum with China.
The BRI.
The BRI memorandum, exactly. I don't think that they did it primarily because they wanted to have a better relationship with China, but they wanted to gain bargain and leverage vis-a-vis Brussels. At the time, that government was supported by populist parties that were anti-EU, and therefore was more an anti-EU move than a pro-China move. Later on, we had a grand coalition led by Mario Draghi. Mario Draghi, the first speech in Parliament, went there to say, my government will have a foreign policy that will be Atlantic and European. That means pro-US and European. So as you see, domestic politics can be volatile. And so sometimes this is something, especially on the Chinese side, is not entirely maybe understood, because of course there is stability in China while there is volatility particularly in certain European democracies, and Italy is surely one of them. So yeah, it's very difficult to say what is the position of Europe. And therefore, the idea of moving on with a comprehensive agreement on investments is even more complicated, because yes, there is an idea of having a working relationship in economic terms with China. That is true. There is also an idea that engagement is positive to level the playing field on many economic issues. But there is also the emergence of the will of many European states to participate actively in the security of the Indo-Pacific, and again, signing up to that idea of the Indo-Pacific, which is not neutral at all.
So it's also an evolving position, but it seems that for a while, confrontation will continue. Do you see cooperation anytime in the future between China and the US? Is that a possibility? And
well, with the US, I think that the confrontation will be the defining feature of the next decade. However, I think there is space to find a realm of cooperation. There are issues. Climate change is the first thing that comes to mind.
Did you expect COVID to be one of those issues?
Yes, I mean, honestly, it was. I didn't have real expectations when the pandemic came out. I thought the international community at large could do better in terms of cooperation, and that depends on everyone, really.
Yes, let's hope sanity prevails. We have so many questions for you, and I will go one by one. I hope you're not too pressed for time. The first question is from Sajjad Khan Masood. This is a bit on a tangent, but it connects China. So you can see if you want to respond. It's a very hot topic. In case Taliban let the separatist movement in China harbor in Afghanistan, how will China react to that? Do you think you can respond to that? Will China fight a Cold War in Afghanistan just like the previous Cold War?
I'm not an expert. I can give my personal take on this. Okay. Compared to what I've read and heard in Europe broadly. There is this idea that the United States are going away, China will step in and gain influence. Honestly, I think it's much more complicated than that. And even for China, there will be a lot of effort in stabilizing and promoting stability in the region, and it will not necessarily be that easy. Just that.
If I may ask, probe on. So Sajjad Khan Masudo has another question, but I think I want to add a bit of my own. Because the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, is an organization I look at closely as well. Afghanistan is in the middle of the SCO, all countries surrounding Afghanistan, and this is one form of Chinese multilateralism. So maybe you can also connect with that. If through the SCO, overall the region, including China, can play a greater role. And Masood's question is that China is unhappy about the US's withdrawal, which is true. Do you think China considers it as a plot against its BRI? This is a perception that some people are thinking about sharing, especially on media. So how do you connect the dots here?
Well, I don't know. Surely there is a tension between an expanding role of China and promoting a foreign policy that remains anchored to non-interference, win-win relations, and respect of other states' sovereignty. And as China is rising and is having interests that are much more global, they're crossing regions and sub-regions that have problems in terms of stability, and Afghanistan is the prime example of that. I wonder how the Chinese leadership would choose to go. And it will be a problem in any case to deal with prudence. Surely China will not be inclined to send troops on a massive scale, which is, I think, is a given, but still remains a particularly delicate issue, and creates this tension, because of course if you promote an idea of regional order that is based on the fact that you can cooperate with everyone, and you don't look in other states' domestic politics, but you have global interest, it's very hard to come with solutions that combine all these elements. And honestly, I don't know. I mean, that idea that the United States would withdraw to create problems to China, I never heard it from Western media, which is interesting. In Western media in general, in Europe and the United States, are just saying, oh, we are losing credibility, we are withdrawing, post-imperial Biden and all that. So it's a very different take, and it's very interesting. And honestly, I think that the withdrawal is simply we ran out of political will.
Yeah.
It's just that. We tried for 20 years, it didn't happen. So today or next year will be the same. Of course, there are tragic consequences, and this is the great part of the story now. But that is sort of the bottom line problem.
That's the bottom line. Another question. This is about hegemony. It is poised that China will. This is from Abbas Baloch. It is poised that China will continue her trajectory towards hegemony, and it is also poised that multipolarity would be future instead of single hegemon. My question is: will the rise of China and New World Order will be more globally progressive driven rather than colonialist, and will democracies survive under China's hegemony? I think, yeah, the question is, you understood it. How do you respond?
Yes. Yeah, of course, there are many layers to this. And the one important thing is that there is no necessary endpoint to the rise of China and the US-China relationship. There is a structure which is important. I mean, there is the fact that China is rising, is growing, exercising more influence, and the United States are not particularly keen to give up their role. So this is a part of the story. But I think that international politics actors matter. So the choices of different leaderships are crucial and will be crucial in the future. So we're not discussing of something that is necessarily destined to happen. So remember Graham Allison was saying destined for war. No, there's nothing that is natural in this. There are choices of policymakers.
Is hegemony a natural? Do you think it's
No. I was just saying that conflict is not necessarily going to happen. Hegemony is natural in the same way. It requires a hell of a lot of work to build, to maintain, and there's nothing natural in this. It's political, economic, and institutional work.
Maybe when the political will is there, just like Afghanistan, the political will, if they're tired of confronting, then...
Exactly. It takes a lot of, it takes domestic consensus, it takes resources, it takes consent especially. And this is something very important for everyone in the region. When your partners agree, is easier. If you have to coerce the others to cooperate with you, it becomes much more expensive. So for this reason, the bottom line of my argument is building an order in which there is legitimacy, in which there are institutions that work, is crucial. Otherwise, if you have to base your leadership, and if you wish, we want to call it hegemony, but if you want to base it on coercion, it would never work. It will be much more expensive. And that applies to Afghanistan, but it applies to the global and regional dimension as well. So there's nothing natural. There's a lot of work to be done. But if other states cooperate, it can be done. Otherwise, it cannot. Otherwise, you will find resistance and conflict.
I again can't hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Oh my God. I this time I'll just go and come back. We have 2 questions. It's been an hour, but I'll be back in
Yeah, no problem for me.
This is so bad. Dr. Matteo? Yes, you're here.
Yes,
Wow,
yes.
this was like less than 15, I think. We have a question from Ali. Anyway, yes, expensive is really expensive and exhausting. I couldn't agree more. I think that's the transition. Let's hope at some point that happens, the realization hits. Question from Ali: how far will India play a part in containing China for the US? This is a very interesting question for me too. How do you respond to that?
I don't think India wants to contain China. I think in India there is a strong tradition of autonomy, non-alignment, and therefore the United States and others in the region are pushing India to align, but there is a strong resistance. Of course, that will depend also on India's domestic politics, but I don't see India aligning with the US and the rest of the US-led coalition. Even if security problems with China could lead to more cooperation in the security realm. But India is a prime example of a nation that wants to promote multilateral order and wants to find its own role within it. And therefore the idea of being sort of not necessarily self-reliant, but autonomous would remain at the core of Indian foreign policy.
Okay. Next question from Ahmed. John Mearsheimer has argued that a clash between US and China is inevitable. Do you agree? An ideological clash, I guess that would also mean.
No, I don't agree. That is the sort of the translation of structural realism in IR to the US-China relationship, right? Saying that since there is a structure, since there is anarchy, therefore the two are destined for security competition or even destined for war. I don't agree with that. I think that there is a much broader role of the leadership that can decide otherwise, can decide in a way that can find room for cooperation, that security competition can be moderated, ideological competition as well can be moderated, even if China and US promote two different sets of ideas and views of the world. There's nothing necessary. There's always a space for human decision in these things, in leadership decision. Even if there are differences, and that is clear. But I think that there is a great role to be played and a great influence to be played by leaders on both sides.
Last question is, will there, no name for this, will there be a tech war between the US and China, like between the US and Russia these days? Will Russia play a part in the US-China rivalry? And I think with that question, I'll again add, do you want to talk a bit about the SCO or how?
Yeah, of course, yes. I mean, I think there will be increasingly competition in the technological realm, both in general. So technology as a way to promote economic growth, and with that, economic power, prestige, a bit as it happened in the Cold War. And also the technological component in the security realm. What missiles and atomic bombs were for the Cold War, probably we'll see a competition when it comes to artificial intelligence, 5G, cybersecurity, you name it. that can be a problem in terms of security, because when a new technology emerges, you have to find a way to sort of limit the dangers that come from applying those technologies to the military realm. So if we want to have the metaphor of the Cold War, the necessity to have institutions and rules for missiles, for nuclear technology, and so on. Probably in the future, US and China and other powers would need to agree somehow on regulating cybersecurity, space weapons, the use of artificial intelligence, and so on and so forth. Probably we'll see a lot of competition, and then an attempt to regulate the competition. And that is surely a part of the situation that we are living and we will live in the future. The other side is Russia. I think there is cooperation much more now than in the past between Russia and China. The fact that 2014 invasion of Crimea led to sanction and isolation from the West in general of Russia on the Atlantic front pushed Russia to cooperate more with China. Of course, there is a similar take on the model of international order that Beijing and Moscow would like to see. Multipolarity, sovereignty, self-determination, all that. However, I think that Russia would not be happy to be a junior partner with China. So cooperation, especially if the rivalry with the United States would intensify, yes, of course. Functional cooperation, yes, of course. Economic cooperation, if needed, yes. Would Moscow accept to be a junior partner? I'm not sure. In which extent? What does that mean? I mean, there is also in Russia a sort of I would call it an imperial mindset of simply the idea of being a great power and being willing to be a great power in the future. That slows down the cooperation within the SEO and also in general with Beijing. So in a certain extent, yes, but not in the extent in which US and Japan are cooperating, for instance. I don't see that. I don't see sort of a rerun of the sort of the monolith of the Cold War, China and Russia together versus the West. For interest, for prestige on the Russian side.
Do you? We are a few minutes, like we've 8 minutes beyond the time we decided, but I do have like two last quick questions. Do you expect or foresee a collision between these two powers? Between China and the US? Because some people talk about, will there ever be a war? And I personally see it to be very unlikely. There could be points, I mean, regions where they would be confronting, but an outright war. Is that something you would expect?
I don't, honestly, of course I hope not, but I don't think it is likely. We have nuclear weapons, and this is the first reason why war is unlikely. So a conventional war between great powers, we didn't have that after World War II. So, but there are dangers. That is true. I mean, South China Sea, East China Sea are just two examples of places in which things can sort of slip out or end because both powers are concentrating military assets, because mechanisms to stop escalation are not very well defined, to say the least, because of role of alliances, that sometimes alliances are working to preserve stability, other times can complicate the picture further. So there is a danger. I will not say it's likely, but there is a danger.
It's a possibility. And the last question, so a lot of developing countries, especially when we look at west of China, talk about the Belt and Road, including Pakistan. But in China, for instance, there is this realization that obviously the BRI was important to broaden their investments, to broaden their relationships as well with other countries, but also that once the Trump administration came after China, they used the term Trump builds China, because that gave the Chinese people, I think you may have come across this term, and Chinese netizens use it, that Trump builds China. That means he gave the Chinese people more motivation to increase investments and reach out to other parts of the world. And then there is also this feeling that perhaps the point when the confrontation will end will be when China surpasses the US's GDP. And after that, both of them would be able to cooperate, because at that time, the US would be able to treat China with equal respect. This is a perspective from Beijing. How do you respond to that? Do you feel that, first of all, the policy that the Trump administration pursued also pushed China to strengthen its Belt and Road vision as well? And that perhaps that point when both can cooperate could be when they're relatively equal, really equal in economic terms.
Oh, that's interesting. Of course, the fact that Trump administration started to discuss great power rivalry more openly, probably gave motivation to China to feel more proud and go out and be more assertive. But I think that especially the Belt and Road Initiative is relatively independent from what the United States are doing, meaning that is a project that emerged well before the Trump administration, and also well before being called BRI in a certain sense. Some
One
of
Belt,
the
One Road.
Yeah, no, exactly. Belt and aside from the name, even before 2013, right? Many of those corridors were there before the idea of calling them and providing the sort of overreaching structure and narrative of the Belt and Road Initiative. So, of course, the Belt and Road gave coherence and gave a project and gave a feeling outside of China that the Chinese influence was going to expand. And I don't think that the Belt and Road has been affected that much by Trump himself. Even if, of course, there was more pressure on certain states to sort of keep up cooperation with China and so on and so forth. But I think that those states that agreed with Beijing and started to cooperate within the realm of the Belt and Road Initiative did so in their own interest and considering that there can be something for them that can be useful. That doesn't mean necessarily that they're not cooperating with other countries, not just with the United States. Examples are cooperation with Japan, South Korea now has a new Southern policy. Japan has been very active in its own Indo-Pacific strategy. So again, I think it's important to capture the reality that is much more complex than one versus the other in every single place, and the reality of states that are open to solutions that provide an opportunity to develop and to grow and to build infrastructures. And they can come from China, they can come from Japan, there can be an American influence. I mean, this is probably the most important aspect of the multilateral system and order that we will see in the future. It's not necessarily, and this is also the deep difference with the Cold War. The Cold War was a world of blocks. The world we're seeing today is a world in which different countries have influence on different places.
Right. And do you feel that that point of cooperation could be when the US, when China perhaps surpasses or reaches the same point of the US in terms of GDP? Do you think that could be
I'm not entirely sure.
A turning point?
I don't know. I'm not entirely sure if that could be a turning point. Because, of course, seeing the statistics and saying, okay, China now is the first country in terms of GDP. I don't think that would sort of switch on something in America that would say, okay, now we're even and we recognize your influence in the world. There was still an ideological dimension that I think is important. And you see it in the Indo-Pacific concept, right? When they started to use the Indo-Pacific concept, meant in order to shape the boundaries of the order, you should be a democracy. So there is an issue of recognition that I think goes beyond the statistical fact of having the same GDP. And that can come in a number of ways, and gradually, especially if we realize that there are certain issues and problems that are global and require the cooperation of China and the United States. And again, climate change can be an example. But it's not necessarily one indicator that would change something. Again, it's political, so it's much more than that. Okay, and honestly, I don't think it will come that soon because of the ideological dimension. But again, you never know.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Matteo. This has been an absolute pleasure. And once again, a shout out to ThinkFest Conversations for helping us understand issues that matter in a better way. So this has been an absolute pleasure. Let's hope we can have you again and learn much more about this dynamic China's foreign policy and beyond. Thank you. And goodbye from all of us for now.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.